being awarded an honorary doctorate by Oxford University, the University of Brighton. Akala has gained a reputation as one of the most dynamic and articulate talents in the UK. And if you look over the wall around you, you'll see the words knowledge and power. This is inspired by Akala's album of the title. It's inspired a whole generation of young people into being not only interested but into studying and to being engaged within the histories of class, race, empire, and Black British history. And just to let you know, within all the spaces, it happens every this Knowledge of Power and Think Tank. Every Wednesday they have different speakers, and it's diverse, it's inclusive, it's engaging. I'm talking about work with Akala.
It's always slightly embarrassing sitting there and right, you try not to blush. How's everyone doing? Everyone good? Yeah. How's everyone doing? Everyone good? Yeah. Amazing. Good evening. I'm not going to take up too much of your time. I'll talk for a little bit. I'm going to talk actually a little bit about the book that I wrote, Natives. Big up Hackney B6, big up Lucy, the whole team here, the students here, the young historians. This is a college that's very fun to me. I've spent a lot of time here, and over the years I've worked with several generations of students here, and they do a lot of really, really great work. But yeah, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the main concepts. I may be preaching to the converted a little bit. I'm seeing some very familiar faces in the room, and I'm sure people will be familiar with a lot of the material, but nonetheless, we'll have a chat anyway. So I wrote a book called Natives, Race and Class in the Ruins of Empire. And what I felt like I was trying to accomplish and trying to say was to look at, I came from a family that on paper, fits all of the negative stereotypes about, working class black youth, didn't grow up with my dad, free school meals, uncles in prison, all sorts of tick boxes that on paper should look like my life should have gone in a particular direction. And listen, I'm not going to say when I was a teenager, there were not some techie experiences. There are some people in here that knew my friends when we were teenagers, and we made some mistakes. Nonetheless, I got to a stage in life where my life was panned out, given where I, free school meals, all those things that we said, did very, very well in school, almost played Premier League football, but that didn't quite work out, it wasn't for me at a certain stage. And I'd been successful. Now, in the logic of modern Britain, particularly post-Thatcherite Britain, I'm supposed to say to you, I made it because I'm so wonderful and I'm so smart, and if all the other poor people just pulled their socks up and worked hard, they'd all just be like me, and therefore, basically become a Tory, right? That's the way that incentives are structured in this society. But really, if you make it as a person from a tough background like me, you're supposed to say, and it's understandable in a way, right? When you think about it, if you come from a difficult, challenging circumstance and a difficult start in life, you probably have worked really hard to get where you are. You probably didn't get there just by accident. But you are nonetheless encouraged by the society to ignore all of the things that helped you to get where you are. And all of the policies that you benefited from even. So, for example, yes, I grew up on free school meals, but there were free school meals to have. I grew up in a social house in Zone 2, in council housing. In Zone 2, one of the most expensive cities in the world. But there was social housing to have. I went to special Pan-African Black Saturday school. There was a Black Saturday school in my community for me to go to. Right, for me to be enrolled in, for me to achieve some knowledge of self. And even some of my elders who were naughty boys, to put it mildly, a lot of those were the people who said, if you drop out of school, we're going to bust your head. Right? So there was a whole framework around somebody like me that allowed me to become a self-made man, right? So for example, when I was put in a special needs group in primary school, so in my primary school I was put in a special needs group for kids who don't speak English. Is a very common thing that happens to young black boys in general, and interestingly, specifically those that tend to be reasonably academically gifted. So it's not actually random either, right? So this happened to David Olusoga, the historian who you may know. This happened to Steve McQueen, the screenwriter who you may know. This happened to Simeon Brown, the journalist who works at Channel 4 now, and I'm sure happened to many people in this room, right? These classes for children with special needs. What's happening?
Pull that window in.
It's all right, I'll do. Generator was just like, I don't want to listen to it. Now, these classes are a legacy of both racism and classism, which we'll come into, but in a British context in particular, there was a whole sort of era of eugenics-inspired writing about education that said basically poor people are dumb, right? In general, even poor white people, they're very dumb, so you have to give them a crap quality of education to justify the prevailing inequality. And out of these, they invented schools for the mentally subnormal, they used to be called. Then that became a little politically incorrect, and they called them schools for the educationally subnormal. It was a little bit more of a palatable term. When people came from the Caribbean after the war, many of us grandparents in the room came as part of that period. One of the great ironies of, again, something we're going to talk about in a little bit, imperialism, is that the schools that the British set up in the Caribbean were basically strict Edwardian era grammar schools designed to produce a middle class bureaucracy capable of governing the colony upon independence. So ironically, and this is even true today, the top school in Jamaica today, a school called Campion College, has 100% A-level pass rate. Even the school ranked 30th in Jamaica, the A-level pass rate is about 75%. Now don't get me wrong, Jamaica is also a deeply classist country and has its own problems, and there's basically 30 incredible schools and then complete drop-off. If you're poor in Jamaica and you're not extremely bright, you're basically screwed, right? But because the school system is selected by ability, a lot of people may not know this, Vibes Cartel went to the same school as the current Prime Minister. He was a very bright lad, right? Sasko went to that same school, Sasko one of the dance artists, and so one of the great ironies of a country like Jamaica is that even youths from the ghetto, if they're very bright, end up in excellent schools with middle class kids and with the kids of multi-millionaires. Alkaline was in my friend's class at a school called Arden, and my friend's father is one of the most successful reggae musicians in the country. You can imagine, came from a very, very prosperous home, but ends up in a school with lots of children from more tougher backgrounds. What is the point I'm making here is that we've got Professor Gus John in the house as well, and he'll know about this more than anyone because he wrote one of the early books that was really looking at this, right? Well, people came from the Caribbean, where educational standards were high, where parents expected children to actually try in school, where there was a very specific kind of actually strict, very socially conservative culture, contrary to the way in which black people were portrayed in this country. They ended up in schools that were designed to produce crap outcomes, even for working class white kids. And so you have this great irony of a massive downgrade in the quality of education you receive, and then on top of that, you've got all of the racism that comes with it that says black children are just stupid anyway. And the British government and the American government, even more extremely, are playing this really interesting game where if you go to the Caribbean today, any Caribbean island, you pick Barbados, Antigua, Jamaica, wherever, you'll see signs from British universities advertising to sell places to middle-class Caribbean kids. And if you look at where those signs are, they're in the middle-class areas, they're on Hope Road, right? So they're trying to sell university places to middle-class Caribbean kids while simultaneously telling you, in England, as those of us who grown up here will know, that Caribbean culture is anti-education and all this kind of crap. What's even more fascinating, and I know I'm going a long way to make my point here, is that Our World in Data, which is one of the most respected data sources in the world, they do data for the UN and so on, they released a huge study, one of the biggest studies done, on family mating patterns around the world a few years ago. And why do I mention this in this context, right? Over the last 15 years since I got into my 20s, I've spent quite a lot of time out there in the Caribbean. I think this is relevant to my educational experience here, and to a lot of our experiences here. Particularly many of us who don't get to spend as much time back in the Caribbean, going back and forth like, say, Caribbean Americans in Miami do. And one of the things that really struck me was in any even moderately middle-class area, I could see the kind of family mating patterns that we in England would associate with Indian people or Nigerian people. Basically, extremely large families, all eating together, mum and dad married. I look at all of my even moderately middle-class friends in the Caribbean. Their parents are almost invariably married, and even the more working class families, what you find is even if dad's in New York trying to make her money and send the money back, that's what he's doing. Mum's maybe gone to Florida because that's the only place she could get work, and you have this phenomenon they call in the Caribbean barrel picnic. But the parents haven't abandoned the children. They in fact have made an enormous sacrifice to go abroad to send money back for the picnic day. And then I thought back to my own granddad. My granddad left Jamaica a married man. He lived in England for 5 years before he had enough money to send for his wife and kid. Now it's true, in that time, he had a child with my grandmother, which was my dad. He's just a human. But what the current narrative is around black fatherhood, particularly, is not that, itinerant migrant workers in a very difficult situation sometimes had, families broke up, families were under stress, whatever else. And if you compare like-for-like populations, if you were to compare, say, the black Caribbean peasantry with the peasantry of Eastern Europe, you would find actually, which you do find, this is why I reference the Our World in Data, you find virtually identical rates of single parenthood. But when black people exhibit the same problems other human beings exhibit, within the same social group, it becomes about blackness. It doesn't become about social class. And what I say this because one of the reasons I looked this up is because when I started to look around the Caribbean, all I could see everywhere, anywhere where people were prosperous, was married families. I was like, well, hold on a minute, I thought Caribbean dads abandoned their kids. That was the narrative I grew up with. The narrative wasn't working class families sometimes find it difficult, money in our keep, rent's tough. Like, none of this is that controversial. To give an example of it, in Japan, when the asset bubble burst in Japan around the millennium, immediately the divorce rate doubled virtually overnight, and the marriage rate went down by 25%, even in a rich, prosperous country like Japan. In our generation here in Britain, there's a whole generation of people who are not going to have kids until their late 30s or early 40s because they can't afford a house. It's literally that simple. Like, they'd have been able to afford a house, like our grandparents. At 23, my grandmother was a cleaner. She bought a flat in pre-gentrified King's Cross on a cleaner's salary, right? You could be on a professor's salary today, you're not going to buy it. And so out of all this context and all these narratives around Caribbean families, I was put in this special needs class for kids who didn't speak English. And what was interesting to me, again, coming back to, you know, how I made it and how I got out of the circumstances I was in and so on, it was actually my Black Saturday school, this extra support network that I had, because at the special needs class, they were giving us, you know, hot chocolate and biscuits. I'm 7. I like school, but, you know, I can be bribed with hot chocolate and biscuits like any 7-year-old, right? So I hadn't actually told my mum that I'd been taken out of regular class because I was getting hot chocolate and biscuits. When you think about it, it's quite sinister. I was being rewarded to fail, yeah, which often happens to young people from particular backgrounds, young men specifically, being rewarded to fail. This teacher was rewarding me to fail. But luckily, my Black Saturday school noticed his behaviour started to change, his attitude started to change. Something is wrong. And they noticed that I didn't put in a special needs group, which I said. Like I said, my school didn't think I had educational difficulties, which is why they didn't talk to my parents about it. They just thought, wow, this 7-year-old black boy thinks he's going to read Lord of the Rings. And what's worse is he thinks he's entitled to all of the best things about this country. And we didn't invite you here to enjoy those things. We invited your grandparents and parents to do menial jobs and stay in their position. We don't even want to share those things with lower class white people. What makes you think we want to share them with you? So my teacher was, in a way, now she wasn't saying any of this out loud, but this is what she was doing and what many other teachers were doing. And so I say that to say this. I had many other negative experiences with the police, in school, so on and so forth throughout life. And in my early 30s, I tried to make sense of these things. Right? Was this just my random experiences? Is this something that happened to me in a vacuum? Luckily, because of Pan-African Saturday School, because of the radical tradition, because of many people like yourselves, including some of the people literally in this room, I already had a framework within which to analyze some of my experiences. And that's why I say race and class in the ruins of empire. So what do we mean when we say race, right? People often assume that race is simply about phenotype, right? It isn't. And actually from traveling the world, you see very, very clearly that's one way. What is it Stuart Hall says? Race is the modality through which class is lived, which we'll come back to in a moment. But the first use of the word race in Latin European languages was actually in French, about the 14th century, and it was in reference to the breeding of dogs. It started to become largely applied to humans, surprisingly, only in the 20th century, right? Only in the early 20th century, and actually a lot of it was applied to racial science among other Europeans and so on and so forth. But essentially the argument of race, and not just race but racism, is that there are innate hierarchical biological differences between human beings. But what's really interesting about this, and what I started to find when I did research for the book, was how malleable the boundary of where race ended and began was. So for example, just in the slave colonies in the Caribbean, we found a number of cases where mulattoes, and even sometimes people with 2 black parents, could buy a certificate of whiteness. So you could buy a certificate in the late 18th century to become legally white, which meant to become legally property. You had political rights based on this categorization. I spent a lot of time in Australia in the lead up to writing the book, and what fascinated me, so in Australia they had a thing called the stolen generation, where Aboriginal children were literally stolen from their parents, and basically the Aboriginal was bred out of them by force, right? So they're bred in with white populations. Today, many of those populations, to me and you, I wouldn't want to say they look white, because they would probably get quite offended if I said that to them, right? If you tell them they're not, in Australia the word they use for Aboriginals is black fellas, right? Now, many of these black fellas have, to us, the same shade of skin as a white person, but you can see looking at them phenotypically that they're Aboriginal, but actually their skin is actually what we would call white. What was really interesting to me being in Australia, like so many other places, because you know, this is what's so fascinating about racist people, is they never want to admit they're racist, right? So my friends who are, say, middle-class Nigerians who've moved to Australia, educated black Westerners, black American musicians, they all actually have a really good time in Australia. Because Australians are kind of embarrassed to be racist to what they see in a sense as middle-class, educated Westerners, right? If you can afford to be an Australian, you've got an accent like us, that already says something about your class location. So they're going to treat you a particular way. I went to literature festivals out there, all this kind of thing. I'm in a bubble in a way, right? And this is one of the things I find fascinating about dialogue around race, even in this country, because we have a lot now of this sort of middle-class black conservatives who went to private school kind of going, well, I didn't experience it, therefore it didn't happen, right? Now, many of us could go to Australia and say, I had a great time in Australia. There's no racism here. What are you talking about? And yet people who are much lighter skin in this context, but have a particular historical relationship to Australian colonialism and Australian class politics, are treated very, very badly. You go to prisons in Australia, and these are the people you find in prison. You look at who's criminalised, who's brutalised by the police, and these are the people who are criminalised and brutalised by the police. But my class privilege meant that none of that was likely to happen to me. If the Australian police beat me up the way they beat lots of Aborigines, that would probably end up on the news. And so in many ways, my class privilege has changed my experience of race. Now, if people don't have an appropriate language framework within which to view that, they'll just act like racism is vanished. You get loads of people who do this. They become successful in life and say, well, it's not my experience anymore, so therefore it cannot be. The example I often give people, I say, well, in 1862 in Philadelphia, the free black population in Philadelphia in 1862, 75% of them were literate. One black American entrepreneur had $100,000 in 1862 money. They had 15 private schools, and they had something like 25,000 volumes of books that they had collected in their local libraries. And then I say to people, was there no racism in America in 1862? And they look at me and they realize the silliness of the argument. The largest fruit and vegetable trader in Mississippi in 1860s was a black person. Does that mean there was no racism in Mississippi in 1862? Of course not, right? In apartheid South Africa, there were wealthy black people. Was there no racism in apartheid South Africa? And to give the most obvious and ridiculous example, there were plenty of successful people of Jewish origin in 1930s Germany. Some of them have become the most famous intellectuals in the 20th century. Does that mean there was no racism in 1930s Germany? So race and class often interact in very, very particular ways. It's not to say that race, one of the arguments that I think was made for a long time is that capitalism invented race. I wouldn't quite go with that. When we look at some documents, even from the ancient world, you see some of the same stereotypes and some of the same ugly things being said, particularly about people of African heritage. In Ibn Khaldun, for example, was a great North African scholar from the 14th century, right? Who said some very, very racist things, even though he's one of the greatest historians of all time. Greetings. So those ideas didn't come from nowhere. What I would say is that capitalism used race to justify, of course, slavery and colonialism and so on and so forth. Which brings us on to the second point, class. I mean, this is comical, but this is kind of modern Tory thinking. You know, we're going to spend billions bailing out the banks, and we're going to put everyone else under austerity, right? And we're going to say, you know, it's poor people who want too much, or poor people who are too greedy. But what is class about? It's about how long it takes you to reproduce yourself, to feed, clothe, and house yourself, your relationship to the state, your relationship to the courts, to the police. And all of this is affected by class. And race, as Stuart Hall says, is the modality for which class is lived. If there was no class category for blackness in the Americas, then what it meant to be black would be very, very different. If white supremacists hadn't restricted black people to forced labour for many, many centuries, and they were free to move up and down the class hierarchy in any given way, race wouldn't have meant what it meant. Without class, race doesn't have quite the same impact. Now, what was my experience here, what's interesting for me is if I grew up back in Jamaica, where my dad's family's come from, my entire experience would have probably been very, very different. Because in Jamaica, people of mixed heritage were a completely separate social class. Race in Jamaica was constituted very, very differently. In fact, people of mixed heritage in the Caribbean are still referred to today, unfortunately, as what they call high colour. And what's interesting to me, before I had locks, because anyone who knows how the Caribbean is, will know the Caribbean is still very conservative, so when you've got locks in your head, it's like, oh no, he's one of those crazy light-skinned people who puts locks in his head and therefore he's a rebel, right? But what's interesting, I used to be a barlin. And so even the experience of being pulled over by the police in Jamaica when I was a barlin, and when I had locks, woo, it's two completely different experiences. When I was a barlin, it was yes sir, no sir, how you doing sir, good afternoon sir. Now it's, yeah, I'm going to Nakiara. I swear, it's that obvious. Like I was befuddled, right? So there are all sorts of things that are class markers, right? In the Caribbean, people of a lighter skin, of mixed heritage, and not just people of mixed heritage, but Chinese, Indian, Lebanese, Syrian, anyone who was not a full-blooded person of African heritage was permitted to own land earlier, was permitted to own property earlier, was given franchise earlier, and so on. So you have this class of people in the Caribbean of much lighter skin who in England would be mixed race road units, right? There would be a completely separate experience. In fact, in a British context, interestingly, children of mixed black-white heritage are more likely to grow up in single-parent families, they're more likely to fail in school, and they're more likely to go to prison. This is one of the things that's not talked about. But what's fascinating, even in that context, is it's never blamed on the white parent. Yeah? It's always the black parent's fault. So it's very, very interesting, even though you've got a situation where children with two black parents are actually doing slightly better, which shocks most people when they look at the data, because that isn't the assumption, and of course, because people of mixed heritage are a smaller group. But because the class location in Britain is different, because often a lot of mixed black-white relationships were lower-class white families, with working-class black immigrant families mixing in, there was no leg up through whiteness in the same way structurally. Of course, I'm not denying that there is colorism and that in terms of standards of beauty and many other aesthetic ways, there are those benefits there. But in the Caribbean, it's much clearer, right? The people of mixed heritage in the Caribbean had a intergenerational head start, and largely have often bred in with one another. So my class location, based on looking exactly the same, would have been completely different had I have grown up back there. Whereas here, there was a completely different set of assumptions. Then you go to America, there's another set of assumptions again. Because in America, they had a thing called the one-drop rule, which is why you can have someone as light-skinned as Malcolm X be the poster child for black power in America, because his experience was a black experience. And in fact, if you look at a lot of the civil rights leaders, it's not just Malcolm, Angela Davis, Martin Luther King, Muhammad Ali, a lot of these are quite fairer-skinned people, right? Which may say something about who gets elevated even within the black community, right? So there's a conversation to be had about how colorism even affects who we consider to be legitimate leaders, even within black revolutionary movements. In fact, Webb Du Bois and lots of other lighter-skinned black leaders said some quite unpleasant things about Marcus Garvey that were quite colorist. So it's interesting that even you see some of that dynamic being reproduced in a way that's quite fascinating. You then move location again and go to South Africa. And many of us in this room, not just those of us who are light skinned, would be coloured. What was most fascinating to me in South Africa was meeting people who to me looked black. Like, clearly black. And I'm not black, I'm coloured. I don't know what you're talking about.
In July.
Huh?
In July, that's what I was told. I'm coloured, and I was like, well, fair
In
enough.
South Africa?
In South Africa. In July this year.
Because basically, I'm not sure exactly how they constituted the category. Because there's people I met that are genuine, by any measure, they're black. But I think because they don't speak Zulu or Xhosa, and I don't know what the history was behind that, they do not consider themselves to be black South African in the sense. Because so race, even though it is based on some level of, and of course, if we look to what's going on in Israel and Palestine at the moment, you have racialization among people who phenotypically look very, very similar, whose skin color is very, very similar. If you look among Jewish people in Europe, they had to force them to wear the Star of David because, in some cases, how would you know? Right? So race is actually just some made-up bullshit. Right? With black people specifically, it can become a bit clearer because clearly black people and white people look quite different on average. But even within the context we think about during transatlantic slavery, the first black person to vote in a British election voted in 1780. So that means, because he had property, Ignatius Sancho, right? So that means even at the height of slavery, the British government knew, pardon my French, the British government knew it was bullshit. Right? They were perfectly willing, if you were here and you had some property, well, of course we'll break bread with you, no problem. When you look at even what a lot of, and this is one of the things that shocked me in research for the book, if you look at a lot of what Europeans said about their West African business partners, including those from whom they were buying slaves, they were like, yeah man, that's our men then. They're sophisticated, they're cultured, they got this, they got that, this one reads Latin, this one reads French. I mean, the Kingdom of the Congo had an embassy and diplomatic relations with the Vatican from the middle of the 15th century. Right? So it's not, they didn't know, it's not that they didn't know who they were dealing with. The Aksumite kingdom in Ethiopia was sending scholars to Christian Europe for about 1,000 years before what we're told was the European discovery of Africa. Arguably, Africans discovered Europe better than Europeans discovered Africa. That's a whole other conversation. And so what's really, really interesting is it's only after formal colonization of Africa that this language changes. Because of course, if you're a European slave trader on the West African coast, so there were a number of attempts to invade Africa, even in those early periods. But the technological gap prior to the Industrial Revolution between African armies and European armies wasn't yet big enough. So the Europeans got an arse whooping. So there was no way for them to say we're genetically superior to these people because they lost. It's only after the discovery of repeat firing firearms and a thing called quinine, which allows Europeans to survive malaria, that then formal colonialism in Africa happened. Then they could turn around and say we're innately superior to these people. But prior to that, a lot of and even today, a lot of the racism was based on fraud that even the people knew. So one of the women who, Lord Lugard's wife, so Lord Lugard was one of the governors in early Nigeria. His wife wrote a fantastic book on African history. So some of you have probably read it. It's called Tropical Dependency. Now this is a woman who was one of the main beneficiaries of and administrators of colonialism. And yet when you read what she wrote about African history, it wasn't what was written for consumption for the British public. What she basically wrote was that Africans had their time, they had their civilizations, they had a good go. It's our turn now. She didn't write these people are innately inferior and they can't spell and they're stupid and all this kind of fraudulent stuff. She was like, yeah man, they had a good go at it. How would they have conquered those African kingdoms if they didn't know what they were facing? Do you know what I mean? Even the fraud of it is what's most fascinating. It's like, do you think we're that stupid? And unfortunately, a lot of that brainwashing did work for a very, very long time for education. But thinking about class thinking even today, okay, in terms of economic development and so on, a lot of the policies towards third world countries today, which brings us on to our third category, imperialism. A lot of the policies towards third world countries today are designed to keep them at a particular stage of economic development and in a particular type of class relationship. Yeah, where, so for example, if you've got a growing middle class in Ghana or Jamaica or Nigeria, to keep those economies structured in such a way that the middle class has to leave, because the wage structure is too low. Well, I say has to leave, you know what I mean? If they want to earn wages commensurate with their skills, they have to leave. And so one of the ways in which America particularly, completely cynically, and I say this not with admiration at all when I say it's a brilliant strategy, but one of the things the Americans have done so brilliantly is make their country internally racist and repressive towards not just black people, but indigenous Americans, and even in many ways the lower class white population, but simultaneously make America a country in which the most successful and talented immigrants in the world can come and succeed. When you think about it, it's absolutely brilliant. Because what it does is, it encourages Nigerian, Ghanaian, even Jamaican, Indian immigrants to think America's wonderful. I came here and succeeded. What's wrong with these Americans? They have a completely different class relationship, and it encourages you. I see even some of my own Jamaican friends in Florida. Most of us in this room may not know that Jamaicans in America had a completely different experience to us. The average Caribbean American has more money than the average American, is more likely to have a degree than the average American, is more likely to be married than the average American, is more likely to own a home than the average American. So a lot of what we think, about half of the black people at Ivy League colleges in America are actually black immigrants. Yeah, so there's a situation where lots of people we think of as successful black Americans are from immigrant populations. So the Americans have very skillfully managed their class relationship to black and Asian immigrants. We're like, yeah man, come here, bring your skills, drain your country of your skills, come and succeed. And if you think about, if they didn't do that, people would have to stay home. And so they play a very clever game between the way in which they treat and then black immigrants often sometimes sadly turn around and say, what's wrong with these black Americans? Without looking into the history and saying, maybe, first of all, you haven't controlled for levels of foreign education to begin with, which is a little bit sick. People do that here all the time. They say the Africans are doing better for cultural reasons versus the Caribbean. Are we comparing like for like populations? If we compare Jamaican doctors to Nigerian doctors, and then Nigerian plumbers to Jamaican plumbers, who do you think is going to have more similar outcomes? The two plumbers or the people who are Caribbean or West African? So what we're comparing is working class Caribbeans who came over after the war at a particular time of history and faced a particular set of circumstances. Now, unless we control for parental education and timing of migration, we don't know what we're comparing. And I would stake very good money on it that if we compare those West Africans who arrived in the 50s and 60s, whose parents were manual labourers, we'll find the trajectory is almost identical and very similar. I look at even the West Africans I grew up with, some of my best friends. The ones whose mum and dad were doctors and lawyers and accountants back in Nigeria or Ghana are doing great today. And not knocking them, good for them. The ones whose parents were more rural or more from, and I don't say this in an insulting term, I mean it literally, from more peasant families, didn't do so well. It was harder to adjust. There were more stereotypes. Parents had less time. Parents were doing menial jobs and so on and so forth. Maybe both parents couldn't afford to come, so on and so forth. So ignoring social classes as far as it relates to black people, in my view, is one of the biggest weaknesses of some of the current more liberal anti-racism literature. There isn't a single experience in that way. I think Stuart Hall is correct that race is the modality for which classes live, number one, number two. But it's also quite racist when you think about it. The suggestion here is that blackness or black culture or black identity or whatever it is the police say is more powerful than whether or not your parents are doctors and whether your parents are in prison. And even among white kids, when you start adjusting for white kids who've got parents in jail or parents on drugs or parents with alcohol problems, I went to school with many white kids with those kinds of problems, where do they end up? The same place the black kids end up with the same problems, right? So there's a way of presenting the problems of the black underclass as general black problems, right? And what's really, really interesting is as more and more African and Caribbean countries develop economically, similar to what we've seen in Asia over the last generation, So let's take South Korea as an example. Today, one of the things that people do is, oh, well, look at the Asians. They go to America and they do very, very well, particularly people from South Korea and these kind of countries. What's most fascinating is the American government supported fairly radical, fairly socialist policies in South Korea because of the threat of Chinese and Soviet communism. So, for example, one of the things the American government supported was radical land reform in South Korea, in Japan, in Taiwan, all these places. In other words, South Korean peasants got their 40 acres and a mule in a way that black Americans never did. The American government understands this, they're not stupid, right? So they made sure those people got their 40 acres and a mule and specifically used that land ownership to parlay into a middle class standard of living where they can now come to America to compete. Black Americans were never given any of those things, were never allowed access to any of those things, and they say, what's wrong with these people and their culture? And if you're not careful, now don't get me wrong, there are some bad behaviors. Even myself as a young man, there's some things I look back on now and I think, wow, I can't say my mum and my dad, to be honest, even though I didn't grow up with them, didn't show me right from wrong. But like many young men, I went through a period of life where I thought I was a bad man. It happens. But that same thing happens to most white lads in the same group. As anyone who's in the real world will know, this image they have that this is specific to black people. You're not going to go to Tower Hamlets and take none of the Bengali youth for Egypt, because they won't have it. You're not going to go to Handsworth and take the British Pakistani youth for Egypt, because they're not going to have it. It's the idea that black people are more street nonsense, right? The street is the street, and doctors and lawyers and accountants are doctors and lawyers and accountants. Which again, they understand when it comes to their own populations. But in terms of imperialism today, I think, and this was again one of the main theses of the book, does anyone know what's going on in this picture? Not you. No, go on.
I'm not 100% sure. I think it's when the Indian space program was launched, right?
Bingo.
Yeah.
Right, so I usually use this picture, right? And usually what happens is we don't always have someone in the room who knows what the picture is, right? And
Sorry for spoiling it.
No, come on, I'm winding you up. Now, particularly when I've done this at universities and there's a lot of British Indian students, they'll make a joke of it. They'll say, Granny's biryani or it's Diwali or something. They'll make light of it, right? Because of course, this is not the image of what we've all been taught to believe scientists should look like. But for those who do not know, these women are some of the senior scientists on the Indian Magellan mission to Mars. So it's a satellite that scientists in India sent to Mars for about 10% of the cost that NASA can send a satellite to Mars. And I say that to say this. India today is the poverty capital of the world. There are more desperately poor people in India than the 26 poorest African countries combined. The GDP per capita in India is actually slightly lower than Nigeria. And I think this is very important because even a lot of black people, no disrespect, but we look for explanations of black failure in some sort of endemic flaw.
Absolutely.
When you compare comparable societies, they have the same problems. India's been literate for 5,000 years, and it's today slightly poorer than Nigeria. So if there's something uniquely wrong with Nigerians, there must also be something uniquely wrong with Indians. But many of the same black people who make this argument about African countries then romanticize Asia. And I say when you compare Asian countries with a similar political history, they're the same problems. Let's come to the Caribbean. My own grandmother used to say, anything too black can't good. Let's compare Jamaica to Colombia. All of a sudden, Jamaica's problems look like general regional problems. In fact, there are just 3 countries in the whole of Latin America with a single university that ranks at the same level of the University of the West Indies. Just 3. In the whole of Latin America. In fact, the University of the West Indies is one of the highest ranking universities in any of the world's poorer countries. Somehow we still have these ideas and these stereotypes about who we are, even though the facts don't fit. The point I was about to make earlier, which I forgot to make about our world in data, is that the marriage rates in Jamaica and Barbados and Antigua are higher than the marriage rates in Britain. Substantially higher. Jamaica's double, Barbados is 3 times, Antigua's almost about 4 times. But can you see, if you repeat something often enough, people just believe it. Even I believed it. I grew up without my dad, and I generalized my experience as part of the black English underclass. I was like, that's just how it is, yeah, among my social class. Middle class Caribbean people don't get divorced, even when they should. They do what our grandparents did. They stay married and unhappy. But they don't deal with the social scorn of getting divorced in a religious country. Granddad might even step out. Granny might step out too, if we're being honest. But they're not going to get divorced and go to church on Sunday and tell everyone they split up, because there's a social framework in which those relationships operate. But if you take away the social framework, you take away those institutions, all of a sudden people can start to believe things about themselves because their class location has changed, because their race location has changed, because their experience has changed. But looking at stuff like this, we live now in an emerging multipolar world, a world in which Indian aunties can put rockets on Mars, a world in which the largest trading partner for most countries in the world is becoming China. And of course, there's all sorts of issues that the Western media has with China. Let me be quite clear, because I've said some things about China's relationship with Africa and the Caribbean that I think some people have deliberately misconstrued a couple of times.
Yeah, absolutely.
We should not be romantic just because they're not white. But we should also not do business with the second largest economy in the world, because some people want to tell us they're evil. The Chinese got rich in partnership with the Americans. This is a fact. Right? Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger went to China and said, yo, big man, you got like 7 gazillion people, and we need cheap washing machines and someone to sell it. You can't make it for me. And they did business for 30 years, and that's how China became rich, in partnership with the Americans and the Japanese. And now there are a number of European countries who do more business with China than they do with the Americans. So if people are telling African and Caribbean countries not to do business with China, it isn't because they think it's in African and Caribbean countries' interest. Again, I will restate, that doesn't mean people should be romantic. Chinese people are people. They're capable of every virtue and vice that other people are capable of. And they may in the future do some pretty terrible things. It's for leaders in Africa and the Caribbean, in my view, to negotiate the best deals for their people. Yeah? And that's who they should be representing. Now, if our leaders, that's a conversation between us and our leaders. I'm on the illusion that China was on a charity project. Nonetheless, we do live in a world where people, and India is another example, because lots of businesses now being done between India and when you're in countries back home, so to speak, you start to see that actually, in a very real way, the Western relationship is no longer the primary relationship. But there is an emerging relationship, not just with India and China, but with Turkey, with Saudi Arabia, with Qatar, with all of these other emerging economies, in which, in a way, the West kind of has to bargain a little bit now. And if they don't, they'll turn around and 5 minutes later, they'll just be irrelevant, right? If you can go to 7 or 8 other, you've got 7 or 8 other options. And so I would say it's in that sense, not because I'm romantic, that people who are not Europeans are incapable of evil, we're still human beings. But if you've got 7 or 8 different options at anything in life, it's better than having one. And because we're living in a world where I think unipolar American dominance is declining, I do think, particularly those of us who are living in the West, we have a role to play. If we're aware of the sort of geopolitical situation, a way in which we can use our strength and our freedoms, and if we had it, capital and knowledge and skills and so on, to help with development. Because in many cases, you look at the situation in Asia today. In 1960, the average person in South Korea was twice as poor as the average person in Ghana. Think about it. Like, we've never seen a turnaround like that, ever, right? And that was true of Singapore, it was true of Taiwan, and of course it was true of China until even more recently, so 1970s. So there is a world in which technological and economic development has an impact not just on the local country, but on the diaspora. If Ghana looked like South Korea, how many people do you think would still even be living in this country? There's a bag of people who would just be like, oh, I can earn the same money in Ghana. I'm a Ghanaian, you know, right? So it's thinking about our role. You know, our grandparents may not have even consciously thought about it, but part of their aim was for us to come here and acquire skills and technology and capital and education, right, and go back. Now, one of the reasons British schools prevented us from acquiring those skills and that capital and those knowledge and those qualifications, because they understood what was going on. They even if they couldn't consciously articulate why they put the clever black boys in the special needs group, they knew, right, if we let them manage to skate ahead with their strict immigrant parents, we're going to have to deal with them in 20 years or 30 years' time. And we can see now how much the geopolitical relationship, even to a country like Nigeria, is changing. Yeah, where the British Conservative Party, they're playing a very clever game. They're like, oh, okay, what do? Do we oppose more right-wing black and Asian people? Or do we just welcome them into the fold? So look, we have shared class interests. You went to private school in Nigeria. Mikey went to private school here. Your parents are going to keep pumping oil for us cheaply and repress poor Nigerians. Hey, have a seat at the table. Right? So they're playing a very clever game where there's shared class interests and a shared view of the world about who belongs in certain places. And I think a lot of us sometimes we say, oh, those people with their coconuts, their sellouts, they're this and that. Because again, we neglect how they were brought up back home. If you have a belief in hereditary hierarchy from back home, you're not going to suddenly abandon that because you arrive in a country where other brown people are being treated badly, unfortunately. There are some of those same right-wing beliefs. And why wouldn't there? And so I think it's a really, really interesting time where some of the old school racism has costs to it. You have a situation where British Africans are 2-3 times as likely to end up at university. The group that are on free school meals as poor white children in that same category. There are long-term implications of that. And if those people are prevented from being successful, they may become more radicalized. And so again, the British government, I feel like, is playing a game that is much more geopolitically sophisticated than we even think about. And so I think it's a really, really interesting time. I think there's been lots of struggles that came before, and I wrote the book really to outline and to do away with, I think, the sort of myth of the self-made man. Now that is not to say that people's efforts, people's personal discipline, people's sacrifices, people's knowledge don't have a role in their outcomes. I think they do. But I think we also live at a time where strong community social cohesion, self-support, mutual aid, all of these kinds of things are being deliberately undermined. And if we're not careful, the few people in our community who've been lucky enough to get a position or be successful or get awards or whatever else, will turn around and embrace that view of the world and we say, Bridget, you never built all the roads you drove on. If you had to pay for your own education, could you afford to go? I had this argument with some of my friends, because I used to be a footballer, this argument with some of my friends who actually made it as footballers. And obviously now, they're tax bills and they give it the whole, but I'm like, bro, you lived in the council house. Like, so when you were broke, you were left wing. Like, you can say you're not left wing if you want, it's okay, but when you were poor, you were, in your actual behaviour, quite left wing. Your family were happy to live in social housing, you took free care from the NHS, you went to a school that you didn't pay for, and it's cool, I get it, you're a millionaire now, and so maybe you got a different set of interests, but at least acknowledge the hypocrisy.
Absolutely.
And I feel like we're incentivized to acknowledge our own flaws and our own hypocrisy. And that's an overview of the book. I'm sure some of you have read it, but I think we're in a very interesting moment. And I think as much as there are many awful things going on right now and awful things that have gone on in the past, I think there are lots of also reasons to be quite hopeful and lots of positive things happening that we don't see every day. I don't know if I should have used the Ghanaian version of this actually. Ghana didn't send a rocket to Mars. I don't know if you're aware, but Ghana put a satellite into space in 2017. Right? So, and that's at a stage where Ghana is still a very poor country. When you spend more, I've been fortunate to spend quite a lot of time in Africa and the Caribbean, and for anyone who's fortunate enough, who has young people in this country they're mentoring or whatever else, or people in their family, I couldn't recommend strongly enough that you send kids back home as much as possible. Because some of the brainwashing, you don't realise how brainwashing it is. So you're actually in a black country, and no one thinks being a rude boy makes you more black. They just think, you're a clown. Why are you behaving? Your mom and dad didn't teach you good manners. Like, let's take Jamaica as an example, right? Because Jamaica is the country with the rude boy image. You know how the bad men in Jamaica buy legitimacy? By paying for the kids to go to school. Right. The Jamaican police will tell you this. Like the way they actually appeal to getting some sort of social approval for their badness, they say, well, we better have to pay granny's medicine, we better send the people to go to school. Right? Otherwise everyone's just going to say, well, you're a scumbag, you're a criminal. Because it's a black country, no one thinks, oh, it's okay. You just think, bro, you're a criminal, we don't care about you. Like, and it's really interesting when you see, like, even for me, I've been shocked where I'm like, the national spelling competition in Jamaica is on television. Like, people sit down and watch the spelling competition. Like, it's a thing. Like, they go champs, which is the running competition, and then they watch the spelling thing. There was another thing called the Schools Challenge Quiz, which is like university challenge with the kids. The kid who wins that goes in the national newspaper, and everyone knows the dude's name. The first non-American to win the international spelling bee was a young Jamaican girl called Cyan Matthews. I remember her name. Because she went back to Jamaica and she became a celebrity. She got sponsorship with like the Jamaican, with Lasco, like the Jamaican version of McVitie's, right? And so when you live as an ethnic minority in an institutionally racist country, even those of us who should know better don't really realise that certain things might be weighing on us and we don't realise. Conversely, I would say lots of people back home have things about their own countries that are quite good that they simply take for granted because they don't know any different. Ghana would be an example of this. Ghana has had 7 post-independence schools. Half the country is Christian, half the country is Muslim. Ghana is an ethnically diverse country. Despite all of this, your chance of being murdered in Ghana is no greater than your chance of being murdered in Belgium. Many African countries are actually very safe. You never know that if you watch the news, or if you watch the way Africans are portrayed, or you watch the arguments that are made about African culture, right? Because often people say culture, listen, just be consistent. If the flaws are cultural, the successes must also be cultural. So if Ghana is a poor country with that kind of political instability is no more dangerous than Belgium, what does that say about Belgian culture? Because Ghanaians are living in a much more difficult circumstance. And when you spend time, the thing that struck me most, I spent a lot of time in Ghana, a lot of time in Senegal, was 22-year-old men smiling. That's just what threw me off. Right? I don't know, has anyone been to Senegal in the house?
Was there this year?
So we've got a couple, right?
Was there earlier?
Right. So you'll know that on the beach, right, every day, you have like 10,000 people working out, right? It's mad, like, the whole country's doing chin-ups together, right? But what fascinated me the most, it's mostly young men, as you can imagine, but women too, right? But there was no screw face, there was no where you from, bruv, there was none. It was, hello, how do you like my country? From everyone, like, every single person, hello, how do you like my country? What is, obviously I'm not Senegalese, right? And it was just really interesting to me, and I felt upset that I was thrown off Oh, it's actually quite normal human behavior. But we expect, because we think it's our norm, that young men are going through certain things in this country, young men from our community specifically, but from other communities, where there's some poor behaviors. It's not even you go somewhere where those behaviors are, I'm not saying there are not other issues, because it's not paradise, right? But the gang thing is not an issue. When I tried to explain to a parent in Ghana, who'd never been to England, that our kids get stabbed to school and stabbed on the way to school, she said, so you're at war? I said, no, it's just gang. And she was, so what do you mean? So you have war? Like, she genuinely couldn't compute. Like, oh, so you have war in England? I didn't know there was war. Like, she just, the idea of a child stabbing another child to death was so absurd that she was like, oh, they must have war. Like she, I think she may even said to me, oh, so like Rwanda used to be. Like, that was the reference she had in her head where, that, I get it, child soldiers, all that kind of stuff. Oh, yeah. I didn't know this was, right? So I really feel like, and this is what I'll wrap up with, like with our young people and education specifically, and this is something I'm definitely going to be trying to work on in my older years, but trying to get a lot of young kids, young black kids specifically from here, to go to school, even for a year, it'll change it. Because you'll be in a school with other black children, you can't spell, they just call you a dunce, they don't care. Like, it's not forgiving, like, and I don't mean that even in a bad way, because if you really have learning difficulties, they'll help. But you'd be shocked, like the kids actually think it's fashionable to go to school. Like there's not this English thing of, yeah, it's kind of cool to be a bit dumb because being smart is for posh people, which is something the English promote even to their own middle class white population. So if you're white and you're from, we all grew up with white kids like this, right? Where the brainwashing is, your dad was a bricklayer, so you should stay in your place. And one of the fascinating things about many countries in the Caribbean and Africa that there's deeply classist is among working class populations specifically. They're still, no man, you would have to go to school, you know. There's like, they just don't get why you would go to school and not try. Like they genuinely, I've had this conversation with a black, I've got bare regions in Jamaica, you know, in their 50s, who wear their school t-shirt to still play football against man now. And they don't get why I don't care. Like I swear, a lot of them went to some very good schools, so they wear their school t-shirt and like they show off. You know, say a big school they're going on. It's only realizing like how, I'm like, wow, our culture has changed, but it's changed in relation to class and race. It's changed in relation to racialization, in relation to our class location, in relation to stereotypes and mistreatment and so on. So where even though those of us that often know that, still don't realize just how far the difference is. And so you have a situation where people who are raised in the Caribbean or West Africa go to America and they find it embarrassingly easy to get into uni. Like it's not even, and not just doing regular stuff. There's a great page online looking at the achievements of Caribbean Americans in America. I mean, when I was shocked, it's like the fourth highest engineer at Boeing. That kind of stuff. The third most important scientist on the Human Genome Project. This was just the Jamaicans. This professor at Harvard and so on. And you'd be like, wow, our experience here is actually worse than I thought it was. Like, you know, like, I thought it was kind of bad. But then you really compare it to a different set of culturally similar people who went to Florida and New York, which are not places without problems, especially our cousins who went to the Bronx and Brownsville and these kind of places. And in many ways, they were cushioned by an already existing Black American population, with already existing Black institutions, and so on and so. And so they could slot in and actually move up, because Black Americans had already done a lot of the fighting, which we're seeing with newer wave Black Americans here. And so it's a really interesting time. There's still a lot we can do, and there's a lot of fights to be had, but there's also a lot of reasons to be, within reason, hopeful for the future. Thank you very much, Peter.
Any questions, anyone?
I've read your book in the past. I bought it and read it.
Yeah.
I was thinking about that image about the space program thing.
Yeah.
Quick question. Out of curiosity, so you say that in South Africa there are people in this room who South Africans say they are colored rather than black.
Yes.
Would I? Am I the? Would they think I was colored or black?
To be honest, I don't know. Most of the people who are coloured are of lighter skin, but there are people who would be of a similar complexion to you, that because of the language they speak or the culture they have, that are classified as coloured as far as I understand. Go ahead.
Because to be honest, when we were there June, July, and the brother was driving us, so I did a talk at uni at the KwaZulu Natal in wherever it is. Yeah. And he said to me something, I'm coloured, and he was darker than me, darker than Marlene, my wife. And we were like, how can you be coloured? And he said, because he does not speak Zulu, and he does not speak blah, blah, blah. So it's his accent that qualifies.
That's what I thought.
And we touched on some of that in the MA, remember, when we looked at these things around colorism and brown bag tests and, some of the stuff you've got into. But the quick thing I was going to say was I was in Zambia, in Mbala, with Sister Yajani, you probably know, she lives out there now. And we were reasoning with some people about youth crime over here. And they didn't get it.
They're just confused.
And when we was talking to them and we said, but you've got armed police, and I was reasoning with a policeman, and the serious crimes for them is that somebody thieves some petrol and drive off.
Yeah, man.
Seriously.
Yeah, man.
They have no notion of what youth are doing over here. They couldn't get their heads around it.
For sure.
How can you stab someone on their way to school, or why would your first thing to be to push a knife into somebody? They literally don't get it. And I think I totally agree with you. It's one of the reasons why we ensured that our children experience the Caribbean, parts of the continent, but more importantly, our last two girls went to school in Jamaica twice. And it's like what you said, it completely changed their perspective on why you need to be educated.
What's most fascinating to me, and I mean this without any sort of insult, dealing with middle class Caribbean people, and I mean this without any sort of insult, they're almost like white people. And what I mean by that is this.
Well, I've got
what I mean by
I've
that
got
is
sisters like that.
Like,
so,
they have no concept that being black is going to affect anything in their life.
Yeah.
Like, they're just like, my mum's a judge, my dad's a lawyer. Why are you surprised that I'm not? I've had this with friends of mine, where they're like, I did blah, blah, blah at Harvard, and my son's an architect, and I'm talking to the son, and the son's like, I'm like, wow, like a black architect, and he's looking at me like, what's wrong with you? Like, I'm an architect. My mum was a judge, my dad's a lawyer, you never just heard what I said? Like, there literally is no concept of, they're like, I'm middle class, of course I went to uni. What do you mean prison? Prison's not for people like me, it's for ghetto people. Like, that's and they'll even do the little hand wave, right? So it's and I don't mean that they're like white people in terms of the bigotry, because one of the interesting things when people talk about culture.
Until they come abroad.
Right, absolutely. One of the interesting things about the Caribbean, which we never talk about really, is despite everything that happened in the Caribbean, black Caribbean countries are very accepting of ethnic minorities. Now, a lot of time now, this is something we shouldn't take for granted. Jamaica is a 90% black country.
Too accepting.
Right. The entire army is black, the entire police force is black. If black Jamaicans were fascists, Jamaica would be a really, really bad place for ethnic minorities to live. Except not only is it not, you talk to Chinese, Indian, Middle Eastern Jamaicans, I know very impressive. You can't tell them they're not Jamaican, they're staunch. Right? Because they've been largely accepted, maybe too accepted in some ways, right? There's no sort of, but I would argue I'd prefer, especially in a situation where Jamaica is slightly different from some of the other islands, because of the bigger economy, and unlike the demographics in Trinidad, which has kept the black population having very little social mobility, anyone who goes to uptown Jamaica today, you'll see the demographics have changed. Like, you go to, there's a gym on the golf course in Constant Spring, and you'll see everyone in the gym. That gym 30 years ago was white people, and I would have been the darkest person there. Today, everybody's black. All the doctors, all the lawyers, all the bank managers. So you can physically see some of the social mobility in the way that, while the colorism is definitely still there, it's changing the perceptions of what race means in Jamaica in a very weird way, where you're looking up and your doctor's black, your dentist is black, your chief of police is black, just what I mean. Yeah. But we never talk about the fact that a lot of those countries are very tolerant of ethnic minorities, they're very democratic, right? They've got problems, don't get me wrong, but it's like we are so harsh on, I think, black society specifically, we never really compare them to any reasonable counterfactual. Yeah. So we never look at Jamaica and say, well, we could have, no disrespect, we could have been more like Colombia. I don't think it's very difficult for people to figure out whether life is nicer in Jamaica than in Colombia, right? Over most of the last 30 years. Similar problems, shared problems. Jamaica was getting its coach from Pablo like everybody else, right? But in many ways, the kind of fascistic, government-sponsored state killing at the level that happened in Colombia or Mexico or Nicaragua or El Salvador or Argentina, right? didn't really happen in black Caribbean countries. Maybe there's less sympathy for fascism. Maybe it's because it's smaller. Maybe it's because everyone knows everyone. I'm not saying it's because we're genetically incapable of bigotry. But it's ironic because in many ways Caribbean countries in the modern world have been more fortunate than most of the reasonable counterfactuals. Trinidad, Barbados and Antigua are about as poor as Croatia. The GDP per capita in those countries is the same as Croatia. The Bahamas is richer than Spain. Average wage in the Bahamas is $29,000 US a year. There's no income tax. Most of the world doesn't know this.
No zinc buildings. See?
Right, no zinc buildings.
No zinc
now,
buildings.
what's fascinating to me is why the smaller and richer Caribbean islands, in my view, and I'm not their government, why they haven't made a play for middle-class African immigration. If I was them, I'd be saying, yo, Nigeria, why are you sending all your doctors and lawyers to America and Britain? You could come here, you know, and we're actually, you could just be a doctor, a lawyer, an architect in a black country, and we'll pay you properly, and no problem. Like, a lot of people don't, when I tell even some of my West African friends, like, I've had this argument when they Google the GDP per capita, oh my God, half the Caribbean's rich. I'm like, yeah, it's just, people have this perception that the whole Caribbean is like Jamaica or even more, that it's like Haiti. But many of the smaller islands are quite prosperous and actually could really do with an influx of architects and engineers from West Africa who come to the Caribbean and come to England and end up living on the council estate, and their kids having to deal with all this nonsense. But they definitely would, if you're a middle class Bahamian, I think you're concerned with prison. No? You need to go out there and see how that man I live in, bro. Sorry, go ahead.
I wanted to ask about the black and Saturday and Sunday schools for African youth. Is it possible to bring them back here in England?
There's still some
yeah, really?
So East Side Young Leaders Academy, West Side Young Leaders Academy, South Side Young Leaders Academy, CSEP, run by one of my teachers, Robin Walker. So there's a few that still exist. Those, it's just they're either struggling for funding or they're not as well known. But those provisions have always been there because as you know, the vast majority of black people actually still place a lot of emphasis on education, despite the perception and what's portrayed. I know this from my own experience. I'll be walking through wherever ends you want to, and mum will show me respect because I'm smart, not because I used to want to be a rude boy. Do you see what I mean? So it's very interesting. Even here, there's kind of still an awareness of no, but come on, that's not really what our parents and grandparents taught us to value. Some man made some poor decisions for a whole bunch of reasons, but very few people in our community can say genuinely, I had no one teaching me right from wrong. Man can say, yeah, I made some bad decisions because this, that, and the third, or maybe abusive upbringing or whatever else. But generally, there was an auntie around somewhere, or an uncle around somewhere. They said, yo, big man, you're not supposed to do that, you know. Yeah. But anyway, sorry, please.
Just one interjection. I mean, I think in relation to your question, yes, there are still quite a number of supplementary schools around. We need to revive the tradition.
Yeah, that's good.
And reorganize the movement, but with different objectives. The youth service, as it was in this country, is pretty much dead. It's been decimated. 10 years ago, there were some 3,000 people being trained to be youth workers in any one term in this country. This year, there's only 300. Okay. But meanwhile, as Akala has been saying, the social challenges for young black men have grown exponentially. The question then is, if we don't have an organized youth service with a proper curriculum engaging in the lives of our children, how do we provide the community-based means whereby they learn social education and all the other stuff that can help them be better at self-management and at resolving conflicts among themselves so that they're not sticking knives into one another. That's got to be the function of, whether we can't call them schools, I mean, that would be the kiss of death. Yeah. But we need some provision, some location, some settings where this work can be done, adding to it the whole Pan-African focus that we had with the supplementary schools.
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar, and then Elder Gus John just said it perfectly. You know, we're talking about the disconnect between organisation back in the 70s and early 80s and late early 90s and now. And one of those is the lack of the culture and history and attitudes that came from the Caribbean. You know, there's, Sister Lisa Palmer was talking about Rastafarianism. Rastafarianism is based in Caribbean, Jamaican culture.
For sure.
You know, the ideas of partner, the ideas of you know everybody. These things allowed us to not think about I, but think about we. That has been mashed up in our communities purposely.
For sure.
Purposely. The whole idea of globalization and taking away the jobs out of communities. So man and man couldn't go from Cannon, couldn't go from the bus, couldn't go to the trains, he couldn't get a job. You know, and then focus on the women having jobs and the men not, and causing this division. So all of that made that when the later generation came along, without that culture there, they didn't see the history.
Absolutely.
They didn't see the history, but the history was there. Even our black churches, though we had problems with them, it is a history and a culture. It's a history and a culture. It's culture, and it provided social cohesion.
Agree.
So that you could have Saturday schools. You'd have Saturday schools in churches. You'd have, but that's been pulled out, and so that's why we're here. One of the reasons the Maat Centre and other centres need to be saved, need to be established, so that we can, as Elder Gus John said, put that back into our societies, so that we can resurrect this culture. Because, as he said, I've worked in local authorities 30 odd years, and absolutely, and at high levels, absolutely is by design. Absolutely. Killing off youth centres, children's centres, all of that, social workers with 20 cases, can't manage, and then you had the lockdown, and all of the issues that happened during that time that are now hidden and we're starting to see. It's no coincidence that a 15-year-old, a young man, will kill a 15-year-old girl after lockdown. Mental health issues and the disassociation that's happened, we're starting to see all of that. So absolutely. But that's your excellent analysis, and thank you for all you do, because it is an excellent analysis, and more power to you and others like you.
Oh, thank you.
But that's what
What I would say
that's
also,
why it's so important about the Maat Centre.
no, absolutely. But also we're becoming more culturally westernized.
Yes.
It's presented as black culture, right? And the reason why I refer to lower class white kids so often, they have all the same problems. So if it was black culture, number one, I don't know, you give me uncle. Number one, if there was a general black culture that led to a particular set of socioeconomic outcomes, we'd expect most countries in Africa and the Caribbean to be similar. They're not similar. Half the countries in Africa have never had a civil war. Botswana is actually quite prosperous, been a democracy since the middle of the 1960s. Insofar as there are different institutions and different incentives, black people, like everybody else, respond to institutions, respond to incentives. When there are positive structures that incentivize good behavior, shock horror, most black people go with that. When there are bad situations that incentivize bad behavior, just like everybody else. So if you look at the problems in the Jamaican ghetto, but those are problems shared with the Colombian ghetto and the Brazilian ghetto, and then everywhere else where there was a lack of job opportunity, where there was the Cold War, and where, as if by magic, mountains of cocaine and machine guns arrived, right? This is not a good cocktail for things to go well. And even on a smaller level, we see similar problems in Glasgow and Naples, which were two of the centres for drugs and guns in Eastern Europe. So it's actually ironically becoming more culturally westernized, becoming more used to being part of the Western underclass. More bombardment from American vapid materialism and celebrity culture and video games and all these kinds of other things, which is, I'm not a big fan of the idea that it's just those things are causal, but I think they add fuel to an already existing fire. Similar to music, I wouldn't say music is causal. I would say if you're already a young man with a certain pre-existing set of problems, listening to music all day about murder is probably not going to help you come away from those problems. It's not going to cause middle class yoga mums, including middle class black yoga mums, to do any badness because the music isn't that powerful. But if you've already got a certain set of problems, it probably isn't the best soundtrack.
I think also as well, saying on what you've actually just said, but part of the narratives as well is that you'll find that some people who may be very bright, for example, they will be they'll be encouraged to take their skills elsewhere. You don't remain within your own setting and help to bring up others. You're removed, especially in the white society, for example. If they see that you're particularly bright and you can lead others to change or positive change, then you'll be taken away from that setting. You'll be under the illusion that you've got a seat at the table, and that's by design. That is by design, so that you don't encourage and build up your village.
I would say here what's even more fascinating, what kind of makes America a non-perfect comparison, is one of the great ironies, and I'm not for it, but one of the great ironies of there being formal segregation in America is that the black middle class had nowhere to go but live with other black people. They couldn't live with anyone. So even though there were lots of successful black people in America, they were like, well, where are we going to go? We have to go live with other black people, right? And so it created an adjacent, even if you go to somewhere like the Bronx, there's an adjacent black middle class. You go to the worst projects in Brooklyn, you go a little further up, you've got the Cosby Show style brownstones, right? Which they're gentrified now. But one of the reasons Caribbean Americans were so much more successful than us who came here is because whatever rough black neighborhood they moved into in New York, there was a black middle class 5 minutes up the street. So if you think about the businesses we tended to start here, hairdressers, food shops, etc., they all crashed at a certain point. We always complain, why are there no luxury Caribbean restaurants? Well, there's no black middle class. It's no coincidence that we now got luxury African restaurants because there's an African middle class. This is not complicated. You can't, if you can't afford to eat lobster pasta twice a week, there's going to be no market for lobster pasta in Europe. Do you see what I mean? Whereas in America, the Caribbean American community, when they opened a hairdresser or they opened a food shop or so on, they could sell to the black middle class that was 5 minutes up the street. And so they were able to parlay that same entrepreneurship my grandparents brought here in an American context. They had a larger customer base and they became middle class in America. The difficulty here is because there never was formal segregation, how are you going to coordinate all of the black people to move to one? Without religion, you're not going to get a Golders Green or a Southall. One of the imperfect comparisons you often hear black people make, or at least I heard people make when I was growing up, if we only stuck together like the Asians. All that shows me is we don't know any Asian people.
Well, exactly.
Because they ain't. The idea that they're more unified. When I tell my Asian friends that, they laugh. One of my best friends is Gujarati. His wife's Punjabi. They were together for 8 years before they could tell their parents, because neither of them were sure that their parents were going to have it. What we mean is, Gujaratis stick together, and even then there's a caste hierarchy within that. Punjabis stick together, and even then. So the more accurate comparison would be, say, Igbos, and even then Igbo Christians, rather than saying black people versus Asians, because Asians as a group have vastly different outcomes. If we exclude East African Gujaratis, and we exclude the Gujarati community in general, the average South Asian in England is poorer than the average black person.
Of course.
If you talk to most black people, you wouldn't know that, right? Yeah. And so there's more of a black middle class once you exclude one specific ethnic group of Indians. There are more professional black middle class people than there are Asian middle class people. So it's one specific group of Asian people who've been particularly successful for a whole set of reasons. That would be like, our comparison for me would be Nigerian Americans. And Nigerian Americans are very, very successful. So yeah, if we're not careful, if we don't control for class, for education, for religion, which is the source of cohesion in a lot of those communities, we're making a comparison with a community who all share the same belief system, or at least pretend to share the same belief system. Right. And that belief system is the source of their cohesion, not their Asianness. There is no unity between Asian, Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs. I can promise you that.
Violence, a lot of violence and drugs. There's a lot of it there.
I agree.
So it depends on what's actually being publicised. But don't forget, there's a narrative that's being pushed here, especially when they're looking at education, for example. It is all by design. And we adapt that language. Some of us adapt that language, especially some of the older generation. So they adapt. I hate that black on black crime, or or some of the things that people say amongst their children. You see, all these negative.
But we're not. All I would say to you, you're not wrong. I think one of the insights of my mother being white and my mother's family being a certain type of white family is I've always found it weird. Whenever black people say that stuff to me, and they say black behaviour, I'm like, what kind of white youth did you not go to school with? Because the white boys I went to school with, their parents was on drugs and on alcohol, and they was getting smashed up every day, and they were rude boys and they were in jail. So it's like, you're not wrong that there is an added layer of racial self-hatred on top of that sometimes. But if we go to a similar neighbourhood to this in Glasgow or Belfast or Liverpool, the outcomes are worse. It's not my opinion, they're worse. Because there isn't a lot of middle class African kids diluting the badness, basically. If we go to Pembury Estate right now, we're going to find a mix of youths. We're going to find a bag of youths here in trouble. Then we're going to find a youth whose dad was a lawyer back in Nigeria, and his mum was an accountant. And he lives in Pembury. He's not going to stay there. He's going to uni. So it's like, without treating black people like individuals, when you actually look at the data, you find that in spite of all the institutionalized racism, in spite of all the problems, particularly newer arriving black people who haven't arrived with the baggage of what it means to be black British or black English, whose parents were educated back home, they just skate through because they don't even get it. Like, I grew up with Nigerian youth, like, if they arrived here late enough as well, like 14, 15, so you're already a big youth, you've already got a certain basis. My brother used to say, I'm not black, I'm a Yoruba man. Do you know what I mean? He didn't even, he was like, what do you mean black? I'm a Yoruba man. And when he said it like, that means something to him. And it took him like 5 years to learn what it meant to be black in England. And by then it was too late, he was like, some flash uni somewhere. Do you know what I mean? So I think you're not wrong, but without the class part of it, we start to get black people have a specific set of problems. But measurably, even in this country, middle class black professionals, including probably many of the people in this room. Most of the people in this room, I bet your kids are at uni and doing fine in school. Do you see what I mean? So it's like, even within this room, we got a bunch of people whose kids are doing okay because of the kind of environment.
Don't forget the media. The media is powerful though, Alcoa.
Absolutely.
The media is powerful.
Absolutely.
So they're pushing their narrative.
I couldn't agree more.
Absolutely. Sorry, because cautious of time, we need to get back to Lord.
Yes.
We can't ask any more questions.
Absolutely.
Okay, so, thank you so much.
Yeah, give it.